I used to believe that the richest men in the world traveled with bodyguards, private islands, and headlines in business magazines. I never imagined one of them would open the passenger door of a black sedan and say, in the calmest voice I'd ever heard, "Your ride is here, Miss Carter." The rain had started 20 minutes earlier, the kind that turns Manhattan streets into mirrors of red brake lights and blurred neon signs. I stood under the flickering awning outside the Midtown Hotel where the charity gala had just ended, hugging my thin coat tighter around my shoulders and staring down at my cracked phone screen. The rideshare app kept refreshing, spinning endlessly like it had forgotten the city even existed. Around me, women in $1,000 dresses disappeared into sleek SUVs, while men in tailored suits laughed under umbrellas held by assistants who probably made more money in a week than I did in a month. I was just Emily Carter, 26 years old, junior event coordinator, wearing heels that had stopped being comfortable about 4 hours ago. When the black sedan rolled up to the curb, I barely looked at it at first. Cars like that came and went every minute in Manhattan. But then the driver stepped out. He moved differently from most drivers I'd met in this city. Not rushed, not impatient, calm, precise. He closed the door behind him and walked around the front of the car like he had all the time in the world. He was tall, maybe 6'2", dark hair slicked back from a face that belonged in a magazine ad for expensive watches. The rain didn't seem to bother him. It slid off the shoulders of his charcoal coat while the streetlights caught in his eyes, a strange green that felt almost too sharp for the quiet street. "Miss Carter," he asked. I blinked. "Yes. Your ride." I glanced at my phone again. The app still said searching. "I think there's been a mistake," I said. "I didn't get a driver yet." His expression didn't change. If anything, the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly, like he found the situation amusing. "Tonight has a lot of mistakes," he said quietly. "But this isn't one of them." Before I could ask what that meant, he reached for the back door and opened it with a polite gesture that felt strangely old-fashioned. In a city like New York, the inside of the car glowed with warm amber light, leather seats so smooth they looked like they belonged in a luxury showroom. I hesitated. Every warning my mother had ever given me about strangers in big cities flickered through my mind. But the rain was getting heavier, and every other car that passed was already full. "It's just a ride," he added gently. "You looked like you needed one." Something about his voice made the chaos of the street fade into the background. Calm, controlled, like the world moved a little slower around him. I slid into the seat. The door closed with a quiet, expensive sound. A moment later he settled behind the wheel. The engine started with a low hum that barely vibrated through the floor. For a few minutes we drove in silence through rain-soaked streets, reflections of skyscrapers stretching across puddles like broken glass. I watched the back of his shoulders, the way he held the steering wheel with relaxed confidence. "So," I said finally, trying to make conversation, "how long have you been driving?" He glanced at me briefly in the rearview mirror. That faint almost smile appeared again. "Long enough," he said, "to know where people really need to go." I laughed softly. "Well, tonight I just need to get home." The car slowed as we approached a red light. Outside, the city lights flickered across the wet pavement. For a moment, everything felt normal. Just another rainy ride through Manhattan with a quiet driver who probably worked too many hours. I leaned back against the leather seat and closed my eyes for a second, listening to the steady rhythm of rain against the windows. At that moment, I still believed Adrian Blackwood was just a driver, and I had absolutely no idea the car wasn't taking me home. I noticed the first strange thing about the drive when the car did not turn toward the bridge that led back to Queens. At first I thought nothing of it because Manhattan traffic at night could twist any route into something unfamiliar, but after 10 minutes the skyline outside the window began to change in a way that made my stomach tighten slightly. The bright clusters of Midtown towers faded behind us, and the streets grew wider and quieter, lined with long concrete walls and industrial buildings instead of restaurants and crowded sidewalks. Rain continued to slide across the glass in soft silver lines while the tires hummed steadily over wet pavement. I leaned forward slightly in the seat. "I think we missed the turn for the tunnel," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Adrian did not seem surprised. His hands rested calmly on the steering wheel, fingers relaxed as if he had driven this road 1,000 times before. "No," he replied. "We did not miss it." I waited for him to say more, but he did not. Outside the window, the city looked different now, darker and more private, like a side of New York that tourists never saw. My reflection floated faintly in the glass, my hair slightly damp from the rain earlier, my expression somewhere between curious and uncertain. "So where are we going?" I asked. For a moment he did not answer. The car slowed as we approached a tall metal gate set into a long concrete wall. A security camera tilted downward toward us, its small red light blinking in the rain. Adrian pressed a button on the dashboard, and the window lowered just an inch. Somewhere ahead of us a speaker crackled softly. I could not hear what was said, only the low murmur of voices. Then the gate began to open. Slowly, smoothly. The heavy metal panels slid apart with a quiet mechanical sound that echoed across the empty pavement. My eyebrows lifted. "This does not look like a shortcut home," I said carefully. Adrian guided the car forward through the opening without hesitation. Beyond the gate the road widened into a large open stretch of concrete that looked almost like an airport service road. Tall lights stood on metal poles every 50 yards, their white glow reflecting off the wet ground. For a moment, I thought maybe we had accidentally driven into some kind of private parking area. Then I saw the hangar. It stood at the far end of the concrete lot, like a massive steel warehouse with enormous sliding doors partially open. Inside, bright lights flooded the space, illuminating something sleek and silver that gleamed beneath them. The car slowed again. My eyes narrowed slightly as the shape came into focus. Wings. A long polished body. Jet engines that reflected the light like mirrors. My breath caught before I even realized why. "Is that a plane?" I asked quietly. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he guided the sedan toward the edge of the hangar where two men in dark jackets stood waiting near the entrance. As the car rolled to a stop, one of them straightened and gave a short, respectful nod toward the driver's seat. The other stepped forward and opened the hangar door wider, as if expecting us. I stared through the windshield at the aircraft resting inside. It was not the kind of plane people saw at commercial airports. This one looked smaller, sharper, the kind of aircraft that appeared in magazines about billionaires and technology founders. The rain tapped softly against the roof of the car, while my brain struggled to connect the pieces. Slowly, I turned my gaze toward the driver. Adrian had already shut off the engine. The quiet inside the car felt suddenly heavier than before. "I thought you said this was just a ride," I said carefully. He turned slightly in his seat, meeting my eyes for the first time since we arrived. That calm expression returned, the same faint smile that had been there outside the hotel earlier. "It is," he said. Then he glanced toward the bright hangar where the jet waited under the lights. "It just happens to be a longer one than you expected." I stared at the jet for several seconds before my brain caught up with what my eyes were seeing. The aircraft sat under the bright hangar lights like something from another world, its silver body smooth and polished, the wings stretching wide enough to cast long shadows across the wet concrete. Rain continued falling behind us in soft whispers while the two men near the entrance stood patiently, as if this entire scene were completely ordinary. Nothing about it felt ordinary to me. I slowly turned toward Adrian again. "That is not a normal place for a driver to stop," I said. My voice sounded calm, but inside my thoughts were racing through every possible explanation. Maybe he worked for someone incredibly wealthy. Maybe the car belonged to a corporate executive who owned the plane. Maybe this was some kind of private airport service area, and the driver had simply taken a wrong turn. Adrian opened the driver door and stepped out into the rain without responding. The dome light inside the car illuminated the empty seat for a moment before the door closed softly behind him. Through the windshield, I watched him walk toward the two men waiting at the hangar. His posture had changed slightly. It was subtle, but noticeable. When he stood beside the car earlier, he looked like any professional driver in New York. Calm, polite, invisible. Now he moved with quiet confidence, shoulders relaxed, steps unhurried, like the entire airfield belonged to him. One of the men straightened immediately when Adrian approached. The other pushed the hangar door open another few feet. Their body language caught my attention instantly. They were not greeting a driver. They were greeting someone important. The first man spoke clearly enough that I could hear him through the windshield, even with the rain. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood. Everything is ready." My heartbeat skipped. "Mr. Blackwood." I sat frozen in the passenger seat while the name echoed in my head. Adrian Blackwood, the driver who had opened the door for me outside the hotel. The driver who had calmly offered me a ride. Adrian said something quietly to the two men that I could not hear. Then he turned slightly, glancing back toward the car where I was still sitting. For a moment our eyes met through the glass. The faint smile returned, almost amused, like he had been waiting for this exact moment. My hand slowly reached for the door handle. When I stepped out of the car, the cool rain brushed across my face, bringing the sharp scent of wet concrete and jet fuel. The airfield stretched wide and silent around us, except for the distant hum of city traffic far beyond the walls. Up close, the aircraft looked even larger than it had through the windshield. The nose of the jet gleamed under the lights while a narrow stairway extended from the open door on the side of the plane. I stopped walking about 10 feet from Adrian. "You told me you were my ride," I said carefully. He nodded once. "I am." I gestured toward the plane behind him. Drivers do not usually park next to private jets. One of the men standing nearby lowered his eyes respectfully, as if the conversation did not concern him at all. Adrian studied my expression for a moment. There was no embarrassment in his face. No sign that he had been caught in a lie. Only calm patience. "You assumed I was a driver," he said gently. "I never actually said that." I opened my mouth to argue, but the memory of our conversation replayed itself in my head. He was right. I had assumed everything. The car, the job, the situation, every detail. I looked back toward the jet again, its silver body reflecting the bright lights of the hangar. Slowly the realization settled into my chest like a stone dropping through water. The man who had opened the door for me in the rain was not just a driver. And somehow I had just followed him into a world that clearly did not belong to me. For several seconds, I simply stood there in the rain, staring at Adrian as the realization settled slowly into place. The airfield lights hummed above us, and the massive jet behind him reflected the glow like polished silver. Nothing about this scene matched the story I had built in my head during that quiet drive across the city. Drivers did not have men waiting for them inside private hangars. Drivers were not greeted with respectful nods and the words "Mr. Blackwood." I folded my arms slightly, more to steady myself than anything else. "So let me understand this," I said carefully. "You picked me up outside a hotel, drove me across half the city, brought me through a private security gate, and now we are standing in front of a jet that clearly belongs to someone very important." Adrian watched me with the same calm expression he had worn since the beginning of the night. Rain traced quiet lines along the shoulders of his coat, but he did not seem to notice. "That sounds accurate," he said. I gestured toward the aircraft again. "Then where exactly do I fit into this situation?" For the first time his expression softened slightly, like he understood how strange everything must feel from my side of the conversation. "Emily," he said quietly. Hearing my name spoken so naturally made me blink in surprise. I did not remember telling him my name during the drive. Before I could ask about it, he continued. "You needed a ride." I offered one. "Most rides do not involve aircraft," I replied. One of the men near the hangar pretended to study a clipboard while the other stepped back toward the aircraft stairs, leaving the two of us a little more space in the open air. Adrian glanced toward the jet for a moment, then back at me. "Sometimes plans change," he said. The answer only made my curiosity grow stronger. I looked again at the polished body of the aircraft. Even with limited knowledge about planes, I knew this one was expensive. The kind of private jet owned by billionaires or global executives who crossed oceans like most people cross city blocks. "You still have not explained something," I said. "Why am I here?" Adrian took a slow breath as if considering how much to say. The distant sound of rain tapping against the metal roof of the hangar echoed softly across the empty space. Finally he spoke. "Because tonight," he said calmly, "you happen to step into a situation that is a little more complicated than a normal ride home." My eyebrows lifted slightly. "Complicated how?" Adrian glanced briefly toward the open hangar doors and then back at me again. His voice remained steady, but there was a hint of seriousness behind it now. "You overheard something earlier tonight," he said. The memory flashed back instantly. The terrace doors at the charity gala. Two men speaking quietly about a shipment arriving Thursday. At the time I had barely understood what they meant. My eyes narrowed slightly as the pieces connected. "You were there?" I said slowly. Adrian did not deny it. "I noticed things," he replied. A strange silence stretched between us while the rain continued falling beyond the bright circle of hangar lights. Suddenly the entire night felt different. less like a random ride and more like a carefully unfolding puzzle that I had walked into without realizing it. I crossed my arms again, studying him. So this is not really about getting me home, is it? Adrian looked toward the aircraft once more. The jet engines reflected the light like two dark mirrors. When he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm confidence I had noticed from the beginning. Eventually, he said, everyone goes home. Then his eyes returned to mine with a quiet intensity. The question is whether they understand the world they just walked through first. I studied Adrian for a long moment while the rain continued falling softly across the airfield. His words echoed in my mind, calm and controlled, but heavy with meaning. You overheard something earlier tonight. The memory of. The terrace doors returned more clearly now. The low voices. The mention of a shipment arriving Thursday. At the time I had dismissed it as some kind of business conversation that had nothing to do with me. Now I was standing beside a private jet with a man who clearly operated in a world far beyond charity galas and event coordination schedules. I shifted my weight slightly on the wet pavement. So this complicated situation you mentioned, I said carefully, is because I overheard a conversation at the hotel. Adrian nodded once. Partly. And the other part? I asked. For a moment he did not answer. Instead, he looked toward the open hangar where the jet waited with its stairway extended like an invitation. The two men nearby stepped farther away again, giving us privacy without being told. That detail did not escape my attention. People around Adrian seemed to understand exactly how much space he preferred without him needing to say a word. Finally, he looked back at me. The other part, he said calmly, is that some of the people in that conversation would be very uncomfortable knowing someone else heard it. I crossed my arms again, trying to process that information without letting my imagination run too far ahead. You are making this sound more dramatic than it probably is, I said. Adrian tilted his head slightly, as if considering that possibility. Perhaps, he replied. The answer was so neutral it almost felt like a challenge. I glanced again at the jet behind him. The aircraft looked even more impressive now that I stood only a few yards away. The engines alone were taller than I was. People who own planes like this usually have lawyers, executives, assistants, I said slowly. They do not personally drive strangers across Manhattan in the rain. A faint smile returned to his face. Tonight, I felt like driving. The simplicity of the answer caught me off guard. I shook my head slightly. That cannot be the real explanation. Adrian stepped a little closer, though he kept a respectful distance between us. His voice remained quiet enough that the two men by the hangar could not hear every word. You asked why you are here, he said. The honest answer is that I wanted to talk to you somewhere private before the situation became more complicated. My eyes narrowed slightly. And the jet helps with that. It helps with leaving quickly if necessary, he said calmly. The sentence hung in the air between us. For the first time since stepping out of the car, a faint chill moved through me that had nothing to do with the rain. Leaving where? I asked. Adrian looked past me briefly toward the dark skyline in the distance where Manhattan's towers glowed like a second horizon beyond the walls of the airfield. Then his gaze returned to mine again. Emily, he said gently, you walked past two men tonight who were discussing something very important. Something that does not usually happen in public spaces. I remembered the words again. Shipment arriving Thursday. Port authority. Payment after verification. At the time it had sounded like ordinary business logistics. Now I was not so sure. I took a slow breath. And you think those men would care that I heard it? Adrian's expression remained steady. I know they would. The quiet certainty in his voice made the night feel suddenly larger than I had imagined when I stepped into his car outside the hotel. I looked once more at the jet, the open stairway, the bright lights inside the hangar. Then I turned back to Adrian. Let me guess, I said slowly. You are about to tell me that getting me home is not quite as simple as driving across town anymore. Adrian's eyes softened slightly, as if he respected the fact that I had finally caught up with the situation. No, he said. It is not. The quiet certainty in Adrian's voice settled heavily in the air between us, while the rain continued falling beyond the circle of hangar lights. For a moment, I simply looked at him, trying to decide whether this entire night had become some elaborate misunderstanding or something far stranger. The logical part of my brain wanted to believe that everything still had a simple explanation. But the private jet, the guarded gate, and the respectful way everyone addressed him told a very different story. I let out a slow breath. All right, I said carefully. Let us say you are right. Let us say those men would care that someone overheard their conversation. I gestured faintly toward the city skyline, glowing in the distance. They have no idea who I am. I was just another guest at a charity event. Adrian studied me quietly for a moment before responding. You are correct about one thing, he said. They do not know who you are. Something in his tone made me tilt my head slightly. But, I asked, but they are the type of people who prefer certainty, he replied. If there is even a small chance someone heard them, they will eventually try to remove that uncertainty. I frowned slightly. You are talking about me like I am a loose thread in their plans. Adrian gave a small nod. That is one way to describe it. I turned and looked again toward the massive jet resting under the bright hangar lights. The open stairway leading into the aircraft now felt less like a luxury entrance and more like part of a decision I had not realized I was about to make. And your solution to this problem, I said slowly, is to bring me to an airfield in the middle of the night. Adrian folded his hands loosely in front of him, completely calm despite the strange conversation unfolding around us. My solution, he said, is to make sure you are somewhere safe until the situation settles. I looked back at him with raised eyebrows. Safe usually means my apartment in Queens. Normally it would, he agreed. Tonight is different. His answer hung in the quiet air for several seconds. The rain had grown lighter now, almost a mist drifting across the concrete. Somewhere inside the hangar, a faint mechanical hum echoed softly, like the aircraft itself was waiting patiently. I crossed my arms again. You still have not told me why you care so much, I said. You could have simply ignored the entire situation and gone about your evening. Adrian's expression shifted slightly at that question. Not defensive, not uncomfortable, just thoughtful. Because you were kind to someone you believed had nothing to offer you, he said. I blinked in surprise. When? He gave a small gesture toward the car behind us. Outside the hotel, he said. Most people speak very differently to someone they believe is just a driver. I thought back to our brief conversation under the rain outside the hotel entrance. I had not done anything remarkable. I had simply spoken to him like a normal person. The idea that such a small moment could lead to all of this felt almost absurd. So your grand solution is what exactly? I asked. Adrian turned slightly and looked toward the jet again. The bright lights reflected in his eyes as he spoke. For the next few days, he said calmly, you will stay somewhere that certain people cannot easily reach. My gaze followed his toward the aircraft. Slowly the implication formed in my mind. I looked back at him. You want me to get on that plane? Adrian met my eyes with the same steady calm he had shown since the beginning of the night. I want you to have options, he said gently. The open aircraft door waited silently behind him while the quiet airfield stretched out around us. And for the first time since stepping into his car, I realized this strange night was about to become an even stranger decision. I looked at the aircraft again while Adrian's words settled slowly in my mind. The open stairway led into a softly lit cabin, warm lights spilling out into the damp night air. The idea of stepping onto that plane felt surreal, like crossing a line between two completely different lives. Just a few hours earlier, I had been balancing a tray of champagne glasses at a crowded charity event, worrying about whether the evening had raised enough donations for the foundation. Now I was standing on a private airfield with a man who owned a jet and spoke about complicated situations as if they were everyday inconveniences. I let out a quiet breath and rubbed my hands together to warm them slightly. You realize how insane this sounds, right? I said. Adrian did not seem offended by the comment. If anything, he nodded slightly in agreement. Yes, he replied calmly. From your perspective, it probably does. I gestured toward the aircraft again. Your solution to a conversation I barely remember overhearing is to fly me somewhere else for a few days. Temporarily, he corrected gently, until I know for certain that the situation has cooled down. I studied his expression carefully. There was no sign of panic or urgency in his voice, just quiet confidence, the same calm authority that had followed him since the moment he stepped out of the car outside the hotel. It was strangely reassuring and unsettling at the same time. And where exactly would this plane take me? I asked. Adrian glanced toward the jet, then back at me. Somewhere. Quiet, he said. Somewhere comfortable. Somewhere far enough away that certain people will not waste time looking. I shook my head slowly. You talk about this like it is a simple weekend trip. For me it is, he replied. The honesty in that sentence made me laugh softly despite the tension of the moment. Of course it is, I said. Because you apparently live in a world where private jets wait inside hangars in the middle of the night. Adrian's faint smile returned. Sometimes. I looked around the airfield again. The rain had almost stopped now, leaving only the distant sound of water dripping from the edges of the hangar roof. The two men near the aircraft remained quietly at their positions, pretending not to listen but clearly aware of every word spoken between us. I realized something then that had not occurred to me before. You planned this, I said slowly. Adrian's eyebrows lifted slightly. Plan what? This entire conversation, I said. You could have explained everything in the car. Instead, you brought me here first. For a moment, he did not respond. Then he gave a small nod that confirmed my suspicion. People think more clearly when they see the scale of a situation, he said. I followed his gaze toward the jet again. The polished wings stretched wide under the lights, reflecting the quiet emptiness of the airfield. Suddenly, the choice in front of me felt more real than ever. If I walked away now, Adrian would probably drive me back to the city without argument. But if he was telling the truth about the conversation I overheard, then the night might not end as simply as it began. I looked back at him. How long would I be gone? I asked. Adrian answered without hesitation. 3 days, he said. Maybe 4 at most. I raised an eyebrow. You expect me to disappear for nearly a week based on a conversation I did not even understand. Adrian stepped a little closer, his voice calm but sincere. I expect you to consider the possibility that the world is sometimes larger than it appears, he said. The quiet airfield stretched around us while the jet waited with its door open. And standing there in the fading rain, I realized the next decision was entirely mine. I stood quietly for several seconds while Adrian's words echoed in my mind. The world is sometimes larger than it appears. The airfield had grown even quieter now that the rain had almost completely stopped. Water dripped slowly from the edge of the hangar roof, while the bright lights continued reflecting across the polished surface of the jet behind him. I tried to imagine explaining this night to any normal person. My coworkers at the foundation would probably assume I had lost my mind. One minute I was leaving a charity gala, and the next I was considering boarding a private aircraft with a man I had met less than an hour ago. I folded my arms and studied Adrian again. The strange part was not the plane. It was him. From the beginning, he had never once raised his voice or pressured me to make a decision. He simply stood there with quiet confidence, as if he understood something about the situation that I had not fully grasped yet. 3 or 4 days, I said slowly, repeating his earlier words. Adrian nodded once. That is my estimate. I glanced toward the jet again, the open stairway illuminated like a silent invitation. And if I say no? I asked. Adrian did not hesitate. Then I drive you home, he said calmly. Exactly the way this evening was originally supposed to end. I searched his face carefully, expecting to see some hidden frustration or impatience. Instead, there was only patience. The choice really was mine. That realization somehow made the decision even harder. I turned slightly and walked a few steps toward the edge of the hangar lights. Beyond the bright concrete, the night stretched into darkness where the city skyline glowed faintly against the clouds. Queens was somewhere out there. My apartment. My normal life. My alarm clock waiting to ring in the morning for another long day of organizing charity events and answering emails. I imagined walking through my front door, kicking off my shoes, and pretending none of this had happened. But Adrian's words about uncertainty returned again. If the people from that conversation truly cared about loose threads, then tonight might not simply disappear. I looked back over my shoulder at the jet. You said somewhere quiet, I called toward him. Adrian stepped closer, so his voice carried easily across the open space. Yes, a place where no one is looking for me, I added. That is the idea. I studied the aircraft again. Up close it looked even more impressive, the sleek wings stretching nearly 60 feet from tip to tip. I had seen pictures of jets like this in magazines about technology founders and international investors, but I had never imagined standing next to one in real life. Where does it go? I asked. Adrian's answer came without hesitation. Italy. I turned fully toward him in surprise. Italy. He nodded again. A small coastal town. Very quiet this time of year. I laughed softly in disbelief. You solve problems by flying people across the Atlantic Ocean. Adrian shrugged slightly. as if that was the most natural strategy in the world. Distance can simplify many situations, he said. I looked between him and the jet once more. The open aircraft door waited patiently under the lights while the quiet airfield stretched around us like a pause between decisions. Finally, I walked back toward him and stopped a few feet away. If I do this, I said slowly, you promise one thing. Adrian tilted his head slightly. What is that? I met his eyes. No more surprises tonight. The faint smile returned to his face as he gestured toward the aircraft behind him. Emily, he said calmly, I believe you have already seen the biggest surprise. The jet waited with its door open while the night air carried the distant hum of the city. And for the first time since stepping into his car outside the hotel, I realized I was about to step into a story much larger than the one I had planned for myself. I stood there for a moment after Adrian spoke, listening to the quiet hum of the hangar lights and the distant sound of water dripping from the roof. Italy. The word still felt unreal in my mind. A few hours ago, my biggest concern had been whether the catering team had delivered enough desserts for the charity auction. Now I was considering flying more than 4,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean with a man I barely knew. I looked at the jet again. Up close it looked even larger than before, the smooth silver body stretching nearly 70 feet across the concrete floor of the hangar. The open stairway glowed with warm cabin light, and through the doorway I could see the soft outline of leather seats inside. The entire aircraft looked less like transportation and more like a private living room that happened to have wings. I turned back to Adrian. Italy, I repeated slowly. You do not think that is a little extreme? Adrian shrugged slightly, his hands resting calmly in the pockets of his coat. Extreme situations often require unusual solutions, he said. I crossed my arms again and watched him carefully. The strange thing about Adrian was that he never sounded dramatic when he spoke. There were no threats in his voice, no urgency, no attempt to frighten me into agreeing with him. He simply stated things as if they were facts that had already been decided by the world itself. That calm confidence made the entire situation feel more believable than it probably should have. I glanced toward the aircraft once more. And what exactly happens once I arrive in this quiet coastal town of yours? I asked. Adrian followed my gaze toward the jet. You rest, he said. You eat good food. You enjoy a place where no one knows who you are. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds suspiciously like a vacation. A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. That is one way to describe it. I laughed softly and shook my head. Most vacations do not begin at a private hangar after midnight. Adrian's smile grew slightly. Most vacations are not arranged this quickly. I took a slow breath and looked around the airfield again. The night had become completely still now that the rain had stopped. The wet concrete reflected the bright hangar lights like a mirror, and the quiet aircraft stood in the center of it all, like something waiting for permission to move. My mind drifted back to the moment outside the hotel when Adrian first stepped out of the car and opened the door for me. At the time, I had believed he was just another driver working a long night shift in Manhattan traffic. The idea that the same man owned a private jet and could casually offer a flight to Italy still felt almost impossible to accept. I turned back to him again. You said 3 or 4 days, I said. Adrian nodded once. That is correct. And after that I come back to New York and everything returns to normal. That is the plan. I studied his expression carefully, searching for any sign that he was hiding something important. But Adrian simply watched me with steady patience, as if he had already accepted whatever decision I would make. I exhaled slowly and looked toward the jet one last time. The open door glowed warmly against the dark hangar, the stairs leading upward like the first step into a completely different life. Finally, I looked back at Adrian. You realize this is the strangest night of my life? I said quietly. Adrian's faint smile returned as he glanced briefly toward the aircraft behind him. Emily, he said calmly, the night is still young. I looked at Adrian for a long moment after he said that, the faint hum of the hangar lights filling the silence between us. The night is still young. The way he said it made the entire airfield feel less like a random location and more like the beginning of something I had not planned. I shifted my weight slightly and glanced once more at the aircraft behind him. The jet looked ready to leave at any second, the stairway illuminated, the engine silent, but somehow full of potential energy. It reminded me of those moments in airports when a plane waits on the runway before takeoff, That quiet pause before the world suddenly moves forward at 600 miles per hour. I turned back to Adrian. You talk like this happens to you all the time, I said. Adrian tilted his head slightly. Which part? He asked. Meeting strangers at charity events and flying them across the Atlantic Ocean, I replied. A faint smile appeared again. Not usually, he said. I raised an eyebrow. That does not sound very reassuring. Adrian took a slow breath and looked toward the aircraft again before answering. Most of the time, he said calmly, my flights are much less interesting. I let out a soft laugh despite the strange tension of the moment. The way he spoke made everything sound almost ordinary, as if private jets and international flights were simply part of a normal Tuesday evening. I folded my arms again and watched him carefully. You still have not answered one question, I said. Adrian looked back at me. Which one? Why you, I said. Out of everyone at that event tonight, why did you decide to help me? For a moment Adrian did not respond. The quiet airfield stretched around us while the lights reflected off the wet ground like glass. Finally he spoke. Because you listened, he said simply. I blinked. Listen, Adrian nodded once. Most people at events like that are busy trying to impress each other, he explained. You were paying attention to the people around you. I thought back to the moment on the terrace again. The two men talking quietly about a shipment. At the time I had not even realized the conversation mattered. I had simply been curious. Curiosity can be useful, Adrian continued calmly. But sometimes it places people in situations they never expected. I glanced toward the aircraft again. That is definitely happening tonight. Adrian's smile returned briefly. Yes. The quiet between us lasted a few more seconds while the soft lights inside the jet glowed warmly through the open door. Finally I looked back at him again. You know something strange, I said. Adrian lifted one eyebrow slightly. What is that? I should probably say no, I admitted. Every logical part of my brain says I should get back into that car and go home. Adrian nodded slowly, as if he completely understood. That would be a reasonable decision. I looked toward the aircraft again, following the stairway with my eyes until they reached the open doorway. A quiet cabin waited inside, warm light spilling gently onto the metal steps. For a moment, I imagined what it would feel like to sit inside that plane while it lifted into the night sky and carried me across an ocean. A completely different world for a few days. A pause from the ordinary life I had always known. I turned back toward Adrian and studied him again. He stood there patiently, not moving, not pushing me toward the aircraft, simply waiting. I exhaled slowly and shook my head in disbelief. I cannot believe I am even considering this, I said quietly. Adrian's expression remained calm. Sometimes, he replied gently, the most interesting decisions are the ones we never expected to face. The quiet airfield waited around us while the jet stood ready under the bright lights. And standing there beside Adrian Blackwood, I realized the next few seconds might completely change the direction of my life. I stood quietly beside Adrian while the hangar lights reflected across the wet concrete like a second sky beneath our feet. The aircraft behind him waited patiently, its open door glowing with warm light that looked strangely inviting against the cool darkness of the airfield. My mind kept circling the same question again and again. What kind of person steps onto a private jet with someone they met less than an hour ago? The logical answer was obvious. No one sensible would do that. And yet I was still standing here, still looking at the stairs, still imagining what it would feel like to leave the ground and watch New York disappear beneath the clouds. I took a slow breath and looked back at Adrian. He had not moved. His posture was relaxed, his hands still resting calmly in the pockets of his coat, as if he had already accepted whatever decision I would make. That quiet patience was somehow more convincing than any argument he could have made. Tell me something honestly, I said. Adrian tilted his head slightly. Of course. If I walk away right now, I continued, will tonight truly be finished? For the first time since we arrived at the airfield, Adrian did not answer immediately. His eyes shifted briefly toward the distant skyline before returning to me again. Yes, he said finally. But you will probably always wonder what would have happened if you had stayed. The answer caught me off guard because it sounded less like persuasion and more like simple truth. I let out a quiet laugh and shook my head. You are very good at this, I said. At what? He asked. Making impossible choices sound reasonable. Adrian's faint smile returned. I am only describing the situation, he said calmly. The night air had grown still now that the rain was completely gone. The hangar lights cast long reflections across the polished wings of the jet, while the open doorway glowed like a small window into another world. I took a few slow steps toward the aircraft before I even realized I was moving. The metal stairs felt solid beneath my hand as I reached out and lightly touched the railing. I turned back toward Adrian. "You really expect me to believe this is only about keeping me safe for a few days?" I said. Adrian walked a few steps closer but stopped several feet away, giving me space. "It is the main reason," he replied. I raised an eyebrow. "The main reason?" He nodded slightly. "There are other reasons," he admitted. I studied him carefully. "Such as?" Adrian glanced toward the aircraft again before answering. "Curiosity," he said simply. I blinked in surprise. "About me?" "Yes," he said calmly. The honesty of the answer made me laugh again, though this time it sounded softer. "You flew me to a private airfield because you were curious." Adrian's expression remained relaxed. "I brought you here because I thought you deserved to see the full picture before deciding what happens next." I looked at the stairway again. The warm cabin lights spilled across the steps while the quiet airfield stretched behind us like a pause between two completely different lives. I took one more slow breath and looked back at Adrian Blackwood. "You realize something," I said quietly. "If I step onto that plane, nothing about this night will ever feel normal again." Adrian's eyes met mine with the same calm certainty I had noticed since the beginning of the evening. "Emily," he said gently, "some nights are not meant to be normal." For a moment, neither of us moved while the aircraft waited behind me. Then I looked up at the open doorway one more time, feeling the strange pull of a decision that seemed impossible only minutes ago. And slowly, before I could change my mind, I placed my foot on the first step. I paused on the first step of the stairway, my hand resting lightly on the polished railing while the quiet hum of the hangar filled the night behind me. For a brief second, I wondered if this was the exact moment when common sense should return and pull me back down to the ground. Instead, I found myself lifting my foot and climbing another step. The metal stairs felt cool beneath my shoes, each step echoing softly in the still air. By the time I reached the top of the stairway, the warm cabin light surrounded me like stepping into a completely different world. The inside of the aircraft did not look anything like the crowded planes I had taken on the rare vacations of my life. There were no rows of narrow seats or overhead bins crammed with luggage. Instead, the cabin looked like a private lounge, with wide leather chairs arranged around a polished wood table, soft lighting along the walls, and large oval windows that reflected the glow of the hangar outside. I stood there for a moment, simply taking it all in. A faint scent of fresh leather and polished wood filled the air, and somewhere deeper inside the aircraft I could hear the quiet sound of equipment powering on. I turned slightly when I heard footsteps behind me. Adrian appeared at the top of the stairs a moment later, stepping into the cabin with the same calm composure he had carried all night. The door remained open behind him, framing the dark airfield and the bright hangar lights outside. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then I shook my head softly. "This does not feel real," I admitted. Adrian glanced around the cabin, as if seeing nothing unusual about it. "It will feel normal in a few minutes," he said. I laughed quietly. "You have a very different definition of normal than most people." Adrian's faint smile returned as he gestured toward one of the large seats near the window. "Please sit," he said. I walked slowly across the cabin and lowered myself into the chair he indicated. The seat was so comfortable it felt more like sitting in a living room than on an airplane. From the window beside me, I could see the entire airfield stretching out across the night, the polished wings of the jet reflecting the lights of the hangar. Adrian remained standing near the table for a moment before speaking again. "The flight will take about 8 hours, he said. "You can sleep if you wish." I looked up at him in surprise. "You say that like people regularly fall asleep the moment they board a plane to another continent." Adrian shrugged slightly. "Some do." I leaned back in the seat and looked out the window again. The black sedan that had brought us here still sat near the edge of the hangar lights, looking small compared to the aircraft beside it. Just a short time ago, I had believed the man behind that wheel was simply a driver. Now I was sitting inside his jet preparing to leave the country. The thought made me laugh softly again. Adrian watched me with quiet curiosity. "What is amusing?" he asked. I turned back toward him. "The fact that this entire night started because I could not find a ride home," I said. Adrian considered that for a moment. Sometimes small problems lead to unexpected journeys, he replied. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as a quiet voice from the front of the aircraft spoke through the intercom. I could not hear every word clearly, but it sounded like someone preparing the aircraft for departure. I looked out the window again at the dark sky above the hangar roof. In a few minutes this plane would lift into that sky and carry me thousands of miles away from everything familiar. I glanced back at Adrian Blackwood. You know, I said quietly, most people never experience a night like this. Adrian met my gaze with that same calm confidence. That is true, he said. Then he gestured gently toward the window beside me where the runway lights glowed faintly in the distance. But the most interesting stories usually begin when someone decides to step outside their ordinary life. The aircraft door slowly closed behind him with a soft mechanical sound, sealing the warm cabin away from the quiet airfield outside. I felt the aircraft shift slightly beneath my seat as the engines came to life somewhere behind the cabin. The sound was not loud like the commercial planes I remembered from crowded airports. Instead, it was a deep, steady hum that vibrated gently through the floor like a quiet reminder that this machine was powerful enough to cross an ocean before morning. I looked out the oval window beside me as the lights of the hangar slowly began to move. For a moment, I thought the building itself was drifting away, but then I realized the jet was rolling forward across the smooth concrete floor toward the open runway beyond the hangar doors. Adrian took the seat across from me, fastening the seatbelt with calm efficiency as if this entire scene were simply another routine departure in his schedule. The soft glow of the cabin lights reflected across the polished wood table between us, while the city skyline flickered faintly through the windows in the distance. I leaned slightly toward the glass and watched as the black sedan that had brought us here became smaller and smaller behind us. It felt strange realizing that car had been my last connection to the ordinary version of this night. You are very quiet, Adrian said after a moment. I glanced back toward him and smiled faintly. I am trying to understand how my evening went from a charity event to an international flight, I admitted. Adrian's expression remained relaxed. Sometimes life moves quickly, he said. I looked out the window again as the jet rolled onto the runway. Long rows of white lights stretched out into the darkness like a glowing path across the ground. For a few seconds, everything seemed to pause. The engines grew louder, the vibration beneath the floor deepened slightly, and the aircraft waited at the edge of the runway like a runner preparing for the first step of a long race. I turned back toward Adrian one more time. If someone had told me 2 hours ago that I would be flying to Italy tonight, I said softly, I would have laughed. Adrian studied me with that familiar calm confidence. Most people would, he replied. I leaned back into the seat and folded my hands in my lap while the engines grew stronger. The jet began to move faster, the runway lights sliding past the window in a blur of white and gold. My heart beat a little quicker as the ground rushed beneath us. For the first time that night, the reality of what I had chosen truly settled in. I was leaving New York. Leaving my normal life for a few days in a place I had never seen with a man I had met less than an hour earlier. The speed of the aircraft increased until the ground seemed to vanish beneath us. Then suddenly the city lights dropped away. The aircraft lifted smoothly into the dark sky, the runway shrinking into a narrow ribbon of light far below. I exhaled slowly and looked out across the endless horizon where the clouds stretched like silver waves under the moonlight. Adrian followed my gaze toward the window before speaking again. New York will still be there when you return, he said calmly. I nodded, watching the city disappear beneath the clouds. I know, I replied quietly. Then I glanced back toward him with a small smile. But something tells me I will not see it the same way again. Adrian's faint smile returned as the aircraft climbed higher into the night sky. Outside the window, the lights of the city faded into darkness, while the vast Atlantic waited beyond the horizon. And somewhere far ahead, across thousands of miles of open sky, a quiet coastal town in Italy was waiting for a story that had started with a simple ride in the rain.